The clock on the wall showed 3:47 in the morning, January 14th, 1943. Outside Junction Station 74, the thermometer read -42 degrees Celsius. Dmitri Volkov stood at a wooden table covered with maps. Red ink crossed most of the rail lines. Destroyed bridges, bombed stations, frozen switches ice-coated the windows, ice-coated the rails outside, ice-coated the wheels of locomotives sitting silent in their stalls. A telegram lay beside his cold Coffee Army headquarters. It listed what 300,000 encircled soldiers needed to survive. 80 tons of bread, 40 tons of ammunition, 20 tons of medical supplies, fuel, clothing, morphine. Yesterday's delivery, 11 tons total. The day before, 6 tons. 3 days ago, nothing. Dmitri looked at the numbers. He looked at the maps. He looked out the window at the dark yards where locomotives stood frozen. The men at the front were eating their boots, burning whatever they could find, dying of cold in trenches. The hospitals had no morphine. Surgeons cut off frostbitten limbs with saws. No anesthesia. The screaming carried across the frozen ground. His son was out there somewhere. Mikhail, a sergeant, 23 years old. The letters had stopped in December. Dmitri did not know if his boy was alive. His wife Anna was in the city behind the lines. She worked in a munitions factory, 12-hour shifts in an unheated building. If the front collapsed, enemy troops would reach her street in hours. The supplies existed. Food sat in warehouses 50 kilometers back. Ammunition filled storage depots. Medicine waited in cold buildings. The trains existed. Locomotives were ready. Wheels could turn. The track existed. Damaged, but there. Yet nothing moved. The system had stopped. Not from bombs alone, not from cold alone. The machinery of command had frozen solid. Authorization forms piled on desks. Clearances took days. Officers argued while soldiers starved. Train crews waited for orders that never came. Dmitri had worked these rails for 31 years. He knew every curve, every switch, every weak point. He knew the system was broken beyond any official capacity to fix it. He knew men were dying because of this failure, and he knew that nobody with authority understood what needed changing. The clock ticked forward, 3:48. Outside in the darkness, the locomotives waited, their boilers cold, their fireboxes empty. Inside this freezing office, one man faced a choice that would determine whether thousands lived or died. He could follow regulations, wait for authorization, watch the army starve, or he could break every rule and find a way to move those trains. The maps showed routes nobody was considering. Old branch lines built for timber operations, mining spurs, logging roads from decades past, half-forgotten tracks that connected if you knew where to look. They formed a network the enemy did not know existed. Dmitri stared at those thin lines on his map. His hands were numb. His breath formed white clouds in the lamplight. He picked up a red pencil and began tracing a new path. November had been difficult but manageable. The rail system ran at 60% of peacetime capacity. Trains arrived late, but they arrived. Soldiers got their rations. Ammunition reached the guns. The line held. December brought the real crisis. Enemy bombers began hitting the main supply line with precision. They knew which bridges mattered, which repair facilities were critical, which junctions had no alternatives. They hit these targets again and again. Railway engineers worked around the clock to repair the damage. Crews labored through storms and darkness. They would finish a repair. Reopen the line run trains for 2 days. Then the bombers would return. The main artery was severed 5 times in 3 weeks. Each repair took longer than the last. Each bombing raid was more accurate. The enemy had studied the network. They understood the patterns. They knew the schedules. They knew when trains would be vulnerable, so they destroyed them with brutal efficiency. The secondary routes could not handle the diverted traffic. These were old lines built for peacetime commerce, timber transport, coal hauling. The rails were lighter. The bridges were wooden, not steel. The gradients were steeper than military locomotives could manage under full load. When heavy freight was forced onto these routes, they failed immediately. Rails cracked under weight they were never designed to bear. Locomotives pulling 30 loaded cars up grades meant for 15 would lose traction halfway up. The train would stop. Block the line. Sometimes it took a full day to clear. At Station 41 on January 7th, a loaded ammunition train hit a switch where ice had built up inside the mechanism. The switch failed. The locomotive derailed at 20 kilometers per hour. 3 cars overturned. The wreckage blocked the main junction for 22 hours. 2 scheduled supply convoys were cancelled. Their cargo was diverted to a different junction already operating beyond capacity. That overloaded station suffered its own failure the next morning. A boiler exploded from thermal stress. 3 railway workers died. The station shut down for emergency repairs that would take days. The cargo sat in the snow while soldiers 100 kilometers away went without food. The cold turned routine difficulties into disasters. Switches froze solid overnight. A mechanic might spend an entire shift freeing one frozen coupling lubricants thickened into paste. Metal became brittle. A rail that would flex in summer snapped clean through in these temperatures. Boiler tubes cracked, drive wheels locked. Steam lines burst and sprayed scalding water. Everything failed more often and took longer to repair, and there were no spare parts. No replacement components. No reserve equipment. Every broken locomotive meant one less train that could run. The administrative system added its own paralysis. Every train movement required authorization documents in triplicate. Every cargo manifest needed stamps from 4 offices. Every route change had to be approved by Regional Transport Command. The officers signing these forms were working in unheated offices, sleeping 4 hours a night, eating inadequate rations. They worked by candlelight, no typewriters, no carbon paper, everything written by hand. The bureaucratic delays compounded. A train loaded with artillery ammunition would arrive at a checkpoint. An exhausted lieutenant would examine the paperwork and discover some irregularity, a missing stamp. An unclear signature, a form number that did not match current regulations. The train would be held pending clarification. While it sat on a siding waiting for someone to verify a piece of paper, gun crews 50 kilometers away were rationing shells. Counting each round, making impossible decisions about which targets were worth the ammunition. Those gun crews had no idea that thousands of shells sat just hours away waiting for bureaucratic permission to move forward. Food shipments rotted in unheated warehouses. Bread froze solid. Medical supplies were damaged by temperatures they were never meant to endure. A warehouse full of morphine ampules would be discovered with half the glass vials cracked from freezing. The distribution lists were hopelessly outdated. A shipment would arrive at a station destroyed by bombing 3 weeks earlier, but nobody had updated the central records. So the train would sit at the ruined station until someone figured out where the cargo should actually go. By then, the supplies might be spoiled or frozen beyond use. At Forward Supply Station 18, a young lieutenant named Konstantin Petrov kept a private diary. He wrote in a dugout that smelled of infected wounds. He wrote by candlelight. His handwriting became smaller as paper grew scarce. January 8th. Buried 9 men this morning, not one killed by enemy fire, cold and hunger. We have ammunition stacked to the ceiling, but nothing to eat. We have orders to hold this position, but nothing to sustain life while we hold it. January 9th. 12 more dead. The doctors have nothing left. They apologize before they operate. No anesthesia, no antibiotics, nothing for pain. The men scream for hours. Some beg us to shoot them. We cannot spare the bullets. January 10th. I told the men a supply train is coming tomorrow. I have no confirmation this is true, but they needed something to hope for. Even a lie felt better than silence. Konstantin Petrov died on January 14th from pneumonia and malnutrition. He was 24 years old. He died 4 days before the first emergency supply shipment would arrive at his station, using routes that existed on no official schedule. His diary was found the following spring when the snow melted. It was sent to his mother in a town 500 kilometers east. She kept it in a wooden box until the day she died 30 years later. At the railway junction stations, workers watched this catastrophe unfold with mounting rage. They could see the supplies, food stacked in warehouses, medicine in storage facilities, ammunition in guarded bunkers. And they could see the trains, locomotives that could pull those supplies, cars that could carry them, track that could transport them. Everything required was physically present. The means of salvation sat within reach. But the system had seized up completely. Pavel Grigorovich was a conductor who had worked the Eastern lines for 23 years. One morning in early January he stood in the dispatch office and his voice shook. "The food is right there," he said. He pointed at cargo manifests on the wall. "The trains are in the yard. The soldiers are dying, and we stand here doing nothing." The dispatcher was a man named Yevgeny, 56 years old. Exhausted. He showed Pavel the folders of regulations and requirements. "I cannot release these trains without proper clearance. I do not have the authority." Pavel understood. The system had been designed for a different war. A slower war. A war with time to process paperwork. This winter killed faster than forms could be filed. Dmitri Alexandrovich Volkov was 54 years old. His hair had gone grey at the temples. His hands were scarred from 3 decades of working with cold metal and hot steam. He was chief engineer of the Central Junction District. His territory covered 240 kilometers of active rail line, plus another 100 kilometers of older branch routes. Before the war, he had spent his career optimizing freight operations, moving coal and grain and timber efficiently, reducing delays, eliminating bottlenecks, improving schedule reliability by fractions that added up to meaningful gains. He was obsessively good at his work. His colleagues considered him difficult, demanding, impossible to satisfy. He would notice a 3-minute delay and trace it backward through the entire chain until he identified the cause. Then he would fix it. He hated sloppiness, hated the erosion of professional standards that had accelerated in recent years. Political appointees replacing experienced engineers' maintenance budgets cut to meet fiscal targets. Corners shaved to hit quotas on paper while actual infrastructure deteriorated. Dmitri had fought against this decline. He wrote detailed reports documenting the problems. He argued in meetings with officials who did not want to hear criticism. He made himself unpopular with bureaucrats who preferred comfortable lies. When the war began, he had been skeptical of optimistic assessments. He knew the real capacity of the infrastructure. He knew its limitations. He knew how thin the margins actually were. Now, 20 months into the war, his skepticism had been proven correct in the worst possible way. But being right gave him no satisfaction. What mattered was that the system he had devoted his adult life to building was failing, and the measure of that failure was counted in frozen corpses. His stake in this went beyond professional pride. His son Mikhail was somewhere in that encircled pocket, a sergeant in an infantry company 23 years old. In his second winter of combat, Mikhail had written regularly until mid-December. Then the letters stopped. Dmitri did not know if his son was alive. His wife Anna worked in a munitions factory in the city behind the lines. 12-hour shifts in an unheated building assembling artillery shells. Her hands were covered with chemical burns. She lived in a fourth-floor apartment 3 blocks from the western edge of the city, if the front collapsed, if the defensive line broke. Enemy forces would reach Anna's street within hours. Everything Dmitri loved existed within the space this railway system was supposed to protect. He thought constantly about Lieutenant Petrov's diary. Someone had circulated a typed copy among the railway staff. Dmitri had read it 3 times. The words stayed with him. Orders to hold, but nothing to sustain us. He thought about all the men who had already died, not from bullets or artillery, not from enemy action, from system failure, from administrative paralysis. From the gap between what regulations required and what circumstances demanded, he was part of that system. He had followed the procedures, he had filed the proper reports, he had waited for authorization, and men had died while he waited for permission to save them. That knowledge sat inside his chest like a physical weight, like something cold and heavy that pressed against his lungs. He had always believed in systems, in proper procedure, in doing things correctly according to established standards. But what was the value of correct procedure when following it meant watching thousands die preventable deaths? That question had no comfortable answer. The moment of clarity came on January 13th in a meeting Dmitri had not been invited to attend. He had walked into the Regional Transport Command office to deliver a routine technical report. He found himself standing at the back of a conference room where senior officers were conducting a strategy session on supply priorities. The discussion was entirely abstract, completely disconnected from physical reality. They talked about tonnage requirements and theoretical capacity calculations. They debated whether to concentrate resources on repairing the main line or distribute efforts across multiple routes. They discussed the strategic importance of maintaining schedules versus the tactical need for unpredictable movements. Not one person seemed to understand why the trains had actually stopped running. Dmitri stood in the back and listened for 20 minutes. His frustration built like pressure in a sealed boiler. Finally, he interrupted. "The main line will not stay operational," he said, his voice cut across the room, "no matter how many times we repair it." A colonel turned toward him with visible irritation. "And you are?" "Dmitri Volkov, District Chief Engineer. I maintain the track we are discussing." "Then you should understand the strategic necessity of keeping that artery functional." "I understand that every time we repair it, the enemy bombs it again within 48 hours, Dmitri said. "They have observation posts. They are tracking our patterns. They know our repair schedule better than we do. Then we need better air cover over the repair zones. We do not have air cover to spare, and even if we did, the fundamental problem remains. The main line is too obvious. It is the route the enemy expects us to use, which makes it the route they target most effectively." Dmitri pulled a folded map from inside his coat. He stepped forward and spread it across the conference table. "But there are alternatives nobody is considering." The room went quiet. Officers leaned in to look. Dmitri pointed to a series of thin lines marked in faded ink. Old routes, branch lines, constructed 40 years earlier during initial industrial development, logging railways, mining spurs, timber transport roads built when this area was frontier territory. These lines still exist. Most are inactive, but the track is still there. The bridges are old but standing. These routes connect if you know the network. They form an alternative system. Lower capacity than the main line, slower. More complicated. But the enemy does not know about them. They are not targeting them, because nobody thinks we would use them for military supply. The colonel studied the map with skepticism. These routes are not rated for military traffic. They do not meet load specifications. They do not meet speed requirements. They meet the specification of existing, Dmitri said. They meet the requirement of not being under constant bombardment. He traced a winding path with his finger, through forests and around hills, connecting obscure junctions and forgotten stations. We run smaller trains, more frequent departures. We use the secondary and tertiary lines in combination. We vary schedules, so there is no predictable pattern. We move primarily at night. We rest during daylight reconnaissance hours. We can probably deliver 40% of what the main line used to carry. He looked up at the officers. 40% is infinitely more than the 0% we are delivering now. Silence filled the conference room. What Dmitri was proposing was not a minor adjustment, it was a fundamental reconception of the entire supply network. It would require implementing an alternative system without authorization from higher command. It would mean using infrastructure not certified for military purposes. It would demand coordination across multiple jurisdictions. It violated every standard operating procedure. It bypassed every established chain of command. And it was probably the only thing that might work. The colonel looked at the map for a long time. Then he looked at Dmitri. If you believe you can make this work, then do it. But I cannot give you written authorization. This meeting never happened. If your plan fails, you will face the consequences alone. Dmitri nodded slowly. I understand perfectly. That night Dmitri sat alone in his office at Junction Station 74. The room was barely warmer than the frozen air outside. His breath formed white clouds in the dim light from a single kerosene lamp frost had formed on the inside of the windows. On the wooden desk before him lay the implementation plan he had been developing for 7 hours. Page after page of notes and calculations and route maps. Locomotive assignments for each segment. Crew rotations to maintain security. Fuel allocation schemes to support trains running on routes with no official supply points. Maintenance protocols adapted for winter operation on substandard track. Timing sequences to prevent collisions on single-line sections. Contingency procedures for every failure mode he could imagine. It was feasible. Difficult and dangerous and requiring perfect coordination under terrible conditions. But feasible. The problem was authority, or rather the complete absence of it. His official jurisdiction covered track maintenance within his designated district. Nothing more. This plan required him to commandeer locomotives from neighboring districts to redirect fuel supplies, to issue movement orders to train crews who did not report to him, to essentially assume control over a significant segment of the military supply network without permission from anyone with power to grant it. If he succeeded, the results might speak for themselves. He might be praised, given a medal, promoted. If he failed, if trains derailed on unsuitable track, if supplies were lost, if his unauthorized actions created disruptions elsewhere, he would face a military tribunal. Best case, immediate dismissal, loss of pension, public disgrace. Worst case, execution for sabotage, for deliberately undermining the war effort. The wartime security apparatus did not carefully distinguish between incompetence and treachery. A well-intentioned failure could easily be reinterpreted as evidence of malicious intent, especially if someone needed a scapegoat to explain why the supply situation had become catastrophic. He thought about his son Mikhail, tried to imagine where the boy might be right now, in what frozen trench, under what artillery bombardment, with how much food left, how many bullets, waiting for supplies that were not coming through official channels. He thought about Anna, working her shift at the factory, walking home through dark streets, climbing 4 flights to an unheated apartment, going to sleep wondering if the defensive line would hold another day. He thought about Lieutenant Petrov's diary, those increasingly desperate entries. The final notation before the young man died of cold and hunger. I told the men a supply train is coming. I have no confirmation this is true. He thought about all the dead, the thousands already buried in frozen ground or left in the snow to await spring thaw, men who died not from enemy weapons but from system failure. From the inability of the administrative apparatus to adapt quickly enough to save them, Dmitri had been part of that system. He had followed the regulations. He had waited for proper authorization. He had believed that doing things correctly according to procedure was the highest responsibility, and men had died while he waited for permission to help them. That guilt was becoming unbearable. To continue following procedures he now knew were inadequate, to keep waiting for authorization from people who did not understand the situation. To prioritize his own safety over the lives of thousands, that would be a different kind of death, not of the body, but of conscience. He stood from the desk, walked to the window, looked out across the locomotive yards where steam engines sat cold and dark in their maintenance stalls, somewhere in that frozen darkness 100 kilometers east. His son might still be alive, might be among the thousands waiting for supplies. The official system could not deliver. He turned from the window, returned to his desk, picked up the implementation plan and read through it one final time. Then he took out fresh paper and began writing the first operational orders. The first unauthorized trains moved at 2:15 in the morning on January 15th. Dmitri had spent the previous day in quiet conversations with people he had known for years, people he trusted, people who understood what was at stake. He spoke first with Pavel Grigorovich. The veteran conductor who had broken down in the dispatcher's office. Pavel agreed immediately. He had been waiting for someone to act. He knew the old branch lines from decades of service. He could operate in the dark on routes he had not traveled in years. Dmitri spoke with locomotive engineers, men in their 50s and 60s who had worked these rails since before the war, who remembered when the branch lines were active commercial routes, who knew every curve and grade and weak bridge from direct experience. He spoke with station masters at forgotten junction points, small facilities that barely appeared on current network maps. He explained what he needed, asked if they would cooperate with an operation that had no official authorization. To each person he was completely honest about the risks. This is not approved by anyone with authority to approve it, he told them. If we fail, there will be consequences. Courts-martial, prison at minimum, possibly worse. But if we do nothing, men are going to keep dying in numbers that should make us ashamed. Not everyone agreed to help. Some refused outright. They cited regulations and chains of command. They expressed fear of the security apparatus. They had families to protect. Careers to preserve. Dmitri did not argue. He simply thanked them and moved on to the next person. By late evening he had assembled a core group. Not large, perhaps 20 people total across the entire district, but enough to make this work if everything went correctly. The first train was a test run, a small switching locomotive pulling only 4 freight cars. The cargo was medical supplies and dried rations, not enough to make a strategic difference, but enough to prove the concept. The train departed from a southern marshalling yard that officially showed no outbound traffic scheduled. It traveled north on a branch line administratively designated as inactive for winter. The route wound through forest for 30 kilometers, then connected to an older mining spur that led east. The locomotive ran without external lights, just the glow from the firebox to see by the engineer navigated from memory. They arrived at a forward supply depot just before dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. The cargo was unloaded in darkness by soldiers who asked no questions. The empty train reversed course. It was back in the southern yard before morning reconnaissance flights began their patrols. There was no record of the movement in any official log. No evidence that a train had used that route. The second train ran the following night. Different route, different departure time, different destination, then a third. a fourth, a fifth. Dmitri carefully staggered every element. No two trains used the same route on consecutive nights. No departure times followed a predictable pattern. Crew assignments rotated so that individual engineers knew only their specific segment, not the full network. He falsified maintenance reports to justify why certain locomotives were positioned in locations where they should not be. He arranged for switching signals to malfunction in convenient ways that directed traffic onto his unauthorized routes. He coordinated with station masters to keep lights turned off at specific times to avoid creating visible patterns that aerial reconnaissance might detect. The system he was building existed as a shadow inside the official railway network, deliberately invisible, unrecorded in central dispatch logs, unknown to higher command. A ghost network sustained by trust rather than written orders. It was exhausting work. Problems erupted constantly. A frozen coupling delayed a train by 3 hours. Dmitri had to emergency reroute 2 other trains to prevent a daylight meeting on a single track section. At the forward positions, things began to change in small but significant ways. A medical officer at Forward Station 9 opened a delivery he had not requested and could not explain: morphine, antibiotics, surgical supplies. The shipment had arrived on a train that appeared on no official schedule. The officer did not ask questions. He simply distributed the supplies to field hospitals where they saved lives that day. Soldiers began receiving hot food. Not regularly, not in adequate quantities, but after weeks of nothing but frozen bread, even irregular small portions felt like abundance. They received winter clothing, ammunition resupply, replacement parts for weapons. The men in the trenches had no idea where these supplies came from. They did not know the name of the railway engineer who had made the deliveries possible. They did not know about the shadow network or the risks being taken. But their chances of surviving the winter improved measurably. Meanwhile, the greatest danger to Dmitri's operation came not from enemy action but from his own side. In late January, a regional logistics inspector arrived at Junction Station 74 to conduct a routine audit. His name was Major Viktor Sokolov. A thin man in his early 40s, wire-rimmed glasses, a reputation for rigid adherence to regulations. He spent 3 days reviewing operational records, interviewing staff, examining cargo manifests and movement logs and fuel consumption reports. Dmitri watched him work, watched him fill page after page in a leather-bound notebook with precise handwriting, and knew with certainty that careful examination would reveal inconsistencies. Locomotives operating outside their assigned districts. Fuel consumption that did not match officially documented train movements, supplies flowing through channels that should have been empty. The evidence was there for anyone who looked closely, and Major Sokolov was definitely looking closely. On the third evening, the Major requested a private meeting in Dmitri's office. He sat down across the desk, placed his notebook carefully on the scarred wooden surface, looked at Dmitri in silence for what felt like a very long time. "Your operational records contain significant inconsistencies," he said finally. His voice was quiet and precise. "Fuel allocations do not match reported consumption patterns. Locomotive deployment contradicts the central scheduling database. I have identified at least 18 train movements that have no corresponding authorization documentation." Dmitri said nothing. There was no point in denial. The evidence was clear. Major Sokolov continued. "Yesterday I spoke with a medical officer at Forward Station 9, Captain Lebedev. He told me that 3 weeks ago his field hospital had completely exhausted its supply of morphine. He had no antibiotics, no surgical supplies. He was performing amputations using a carpenter's saw." The Major opened his notebook, turned to a page dense with numbers. Then, beginning approximately 2 weeks ago, supplies began arriving, unscheduled deliveries, no advance notice, no proper documentation, Just trains appearing in the middle of the night with cargo he desperately needed. Captain Lebedev estimates these unauthorized shipments have allowed him to save approximately 40 lives. He looked up from the notebook. I calculate that your irregular operations have delivered roughly 1,400 tons of supplies over the past 2 weeks. That represents a restoration of approximately 35% of this sector's pre-crisis transport capacity. He paused. The official supply system, operating through properly authorized channels with full documentation, has delivered less than 200 tons in the same period. Major Sokolov closed his notebook, stood up from the chair. I am required by regulations to report all irregularities to my superior officers. I am required to enforce strict compliance with established procedures, but I am also required to support the war effort through any effective means available. He tucked the notebook under his arm. I found no significant irregularities in your operations, Engineer Volkov. Your fuel consumption is consistent with increased maintenance demands of winter operations. Your locomotive deployment patterns reflect necessary emergency repairs. Everything appears to be in order. He walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the handle. Continue exactly as you are, but be extremely careful. Not everyone who comes here will be willing to overlook evidence the way I am. Then he left. Dmitri sat alone in his office for a long time after his hands were shaking. Not from cold, but from the realization of how close he had come to disaster. The shadow railway would continue, but the encounter had demonstrated how fragile the entire structure was, how vulnerable to a single person deciding that regulations mattered more than results. The critical test came in the first week of February. Army intelligence intercepted enemy radio communications indicating a major offensive planned against the defensive sector. The attack would begin on February 8th. It would be preceded by intensive bombing campaigns, specifically targeting railway infrastructure. The goal was to prevent resupply during the crucial first days of the assault. For the defensive line to hold, it would need supplies delivered in quantities far exceeding anything Dmitri's shadow network had yet attempted. The request arrived on February 5th. A single-page message from a senior staff officer who had somehow learned about the unauthorized supply operations, handwritten. Not typed. Unsigned. It listed requirements that seemed almost impossible. 200 tons of ammunition. 50 tons of anti-tank mines medical supplies sufficient for 3,000 casualties. Winter clothing for an entire division. Fuel for armored vehicles. Replacement parts for artillery. 3 days to deliver what would normally require 3 weeks through official channels. Dmitri gathered his core team, the conductors and engineers and station masters who had been operating the shadow railway. He spread maps across every available surface and began planning the largest coordinated operation they had yet attempted. They would need to run simultaneous train movements on 12 different routes, coordinating precisely to avoid collisions on single-track sections. Timing arrivals so that receiving stations could handle the cargo volume without creating visible stockpiles. It would require every serviceable locomotive they could access, every willing crew member, every ton of coal they could divert, and they would have to execute this massive operation while enemy reconnaissance intensified, while bombing raids specifically targeted the rail network with increased frequency. The operation began on the night of February 6th. Trains moved through darkness across the frozen landscape like a fleet of ghost ships running without lights on routes that officially didn't exist, carrying cargo that appeared on no manifests. At Junction Station 47, a maintenance crew worked through a blizzard to clear ice from critical switch points a heavily loaded ammunition train had to pass through. Any delay would cascade through the entire schedule. They worked for 6 hours in wind that cut like broken glass, got the switches operational. The ammunition train passed through on time. At Station 18, Mechanics performed an emergency repair on a locomotive with a cracked cylinder head. They worked in temperatures that froze tools to bare skin, worked by the light of handheld lanterns. They replaced the damaged component while the train idled. Got it done. The train continued east. Dmitri himself rode in the cab of one of the lead supply convoys, a 20-car train carrying the bulk of the ammunition and anti-tank mines. They traveled on a route built originally for logging operations. The track was barely adequate for the weight they were hauling. The locomotive strained on gradients it was never designed to climb. Twice they had to stop to clear fallen trees that blocked the rails. Once they passed within 3 kilometers of a known enemy observation post, close enough to hear artillery fire. The engineer reduced speed to absolute minimum, trying to minimize noise. They reached the forward distribution point at 4 in the morning on February 8th, 6 hours before the enemy offensive was scheduled to begin. The other trains in the network came through the night. Most arrived on Schedule 2 were delayed by mechanical problems, but ultimately made it through. One train was forced to take an alternate route when scouts reported enemy patrol activity by the time dawn began to lighten the sky, by the time enemy reconnaissance planes took off. The trains were gone, dispersed back into the network hidden in maintenance facilities and forest sidings. The supplies had been distributed. The ammunition was in position. The defensive line had been reinforced. When the offensive came that afternoon, it was met not by starving, undersupplied troops, but by soldiers who had everything they needed to fight effectively. The line held through that day, through the next day, through a week of sustained assault. It held because men had food and ammunition and medical support. It held because one railway engineer had refused to accept that impossible situations had no solutions. The war ended eventually, as all wars end. The winter of '43 passed into spring, the spring into summer. The desperate defensive battles gave way to sustained offensives. The long campaigns that finally brought victory stretched across months and years. The official histories would record the defensive success of February 8th as a triumph of strategic planning and soldiers' courage, which it certainly was. They would not mention the railway engineer who had made that defensive stand possible. Because his role existed in no official documentation, the shadow network had left almost no paper trail by design. Dmitri Alexandrovich Volkov returned to his regular position after the immediate crisis passed. He continued working for the railway system until his retirement in 1958. 37 years of service total. He never spoke publicly about what he had done during that terrible winter. When colleagues or officials asked about the wartime supply operations, he would deflect with vague generalities. He would say that many people had worked hard under difficult conditions, that he had simply done his job like thousands of others. The few documents related to the Shadow Railway were lost, or destroyed, or buried so deep in military archives that no historian ever found them. In the small apartment where Dmitri lived out his final years, there was a wooden box on a shelf in his study. Plain pine. No markings. Inside were a handful of items he had kept, a faded photograph of a steam locomotive. Number 417, which had been the primary engine for the Shadow network during those desperate weeks. The photograph showed it sitting on a forest siding in winter darkness. Barely visible. Almost a ghost. A crumpled telegram dated February 9th, 1943. One sentence in hurried handwriting. Supplies received. Positions holding. Thank you. A handwritten list of names. 23 people. The conductors and engineers and station masters who had operated the trains, who had risked courts-martial and execution, who had kept the secret. No medals. He had never been awarded any for this work. No official recognition, because what he had done was technically unauthorized, illegal under the regulations he had violated. He had broken rules to save lives. He had prioritized human need over bureaucratic procedure. He had taken responsibility that was not officially his and made decisions he had no authority to make. And because he had done those things, because he had refused to follow regulations that would result in thousands of preventable deaths, those thousands had lived to see spring. The photograph of Locomotive 417 sits in a provincial railway museum now, in a display case with dozens of other period images, unlabeled except for a typed card that reads, Winter Operations, Eastern Front, 1943. Nothing remarkable, just another train from the war years, but to anyone who knows what to look for. That image represents something the official histories have always struggled to capture. That wars are won not only by soldiers with weapons and generals with strategies, that sometimes the outcome of critical battles is decided by ordinary people who refuse to accept that regulations are more important than lives. Dmitri chose conscience over comfort. He chose to act when action was needed, rather than wait for permission that would come too late. In making that choice, he demonstrated a truth that systems and bureaucracies can never quite accommodate, that the smallest person with no authority except knowledge and courage can change the course of battles they will never fight in. The trains ran that winter because one man decided they had to run, and when the system said it was impossible, he found a way anyway.